Okay, the £1 model is like a highly simplified profit and loss. So the main changes are that you put the profit line at the top instead of the bottom. You don't distinguish between your different sources of revenue. You just have one line for revenue. Like one line, I don't care, like doesn't matter where the revenue came from. And then instead of having like 30 or 40 different cost categories, which is typical for profit and losses, you just have two cost categories, and these are labor or payroll, whatever you want to call it, and operating costs, which is everything that is not labor, which is a quite a radically simplified way of doing the profit and loss because an accountant will tell you operating costs are defined in a very specific way in accountancy, but for the purpose of this table, it's like radically simplified so it's easy to make decisions with. And then within operating costs, you might have kind of subcategories and that depends on your business. So for the bakery, our most significant direct costs, and no surprise here, ingredients. And then I don't think any of us were expecting this, like the stock we put in the shop, that's not our own products. And then we shoved everything else into overheads. So the whole idea is that you're really simplifying things, and every like business's £1 model is going to look slightly different depending on what industry they're in. And yeah, I'm showing you here one based on Bread Co-op. For simplicity, let's assume that a bakery is taking in 100K of like annual turnover, annual revenue, and is on track to making a 25K loss that year. Oh, okay. So what does that mean? That means for every £1 of revenue, the bakery is actively allocating 25p towards loss. Now we're like, oh, why is that? Why are they allocating 25p towards loss? Let's see what they're allocating towards these other categories. Okay, we see like, oh, right, they're on track to paying 75K in like payroll costs that year, including pension and everything. So that means for every £1 of revenue that they're receiving, they're allocating 75p to labor. Okay, that's interesting. And then we look at costs that's not payroll. What total does that come to? So rent, bills, stationery, stock, fuel, like fixed and variable costs, or like lump it all together. Yeah. Oh, and it turns out that it adds up to like 50K. That's the equivalent of like for every £1 of revenue that they're receiving, they're allocating 50p to operating expenses. Let's break down that 50p. What is that 50p made of? So when a business first makes their £1 table, they don't necessarily know what their subcategories are going to be in the operating expense within the operating expenses. So you try and pay attention to things that are like really significant variable costs that you have control over regularly. So not like rent. Rent might be a huge amount of your 50p, for example, might be, I don't know, it might end up being 40p, but it's not necessarily helpful if it's something that you realistically can't change. Say in this business, we noticed that, oh, this dynamic cost that goes up and down a lot is ingredients. And out of this 50p, we spend 25p on ingredients in the business. Okay. And then you might investigate, oh, like shop stock is also a really interesting dynamic subcategory within the operating expenses. Oh, it turns out we allocate 15p towards this, and we haven't found any other very interesting costs to pay attention to. So let's lump everything else into overheads, and that's 10p because that adds up to the 50p. This is what a business might look like when they first draw up their £1 model. And this is what a business might look like in need of a turnaround. When they're in need of a turnaround, this is what their first like £1 model table might look like. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, so I mean, I was just gonna just say some things out loud for maybe a bit of clarity. For every pound you make, you're spending, 75p on labor, 50p on operational expenses, and overspending by 25p. And so if you're making, £100,000, then essentially the proportions are the same. So you're making a loss of 25,000. What you're doing is dividing everything by your revenue. So
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
dividing everything by 100K. Whether this company was making 100K or whether it was making £1,000, it doesn't matter. You would end up with the same numbers. The other thing which you just sort of highlighted there is that, at the moment, this business is making a loss of 25p. So
Hmm.
it's in trouble of essentially, if it has reserves, depleting its reserves. If it doesn't have reserves, it's accumulating debt. Exactly. Okay, cool. So yeah, we have this model. We're looking at it and we're like, okay, we've got a problem. So what happens next?
Okay, so I want to explain more why we put the surplus and loss line at the top. It's really
Okay.
important. By putting it at the top, it's like, okay, we are choosing to make 2p of profit for every pound revenue, or we are choosing to allocate 20 pennies of profit for every £1 of revenue. Whatever you decide the profit you want first, and then you figure out what the costs would be needed to achieve that profit. What are they going to have to do with the costs? They're going to have to reduce their costs by 26 pennies. So they're no longer over allocating by 25 pennies within their costs, and they have one more penny left over to put towards surplus. So you might start with operating costs first, because I think people often find that feels a bit easier. So you're like, okay, what pennies can I save from my overheads? Where can I find my 26 pennies? Where am I going to find these 26 pennies? You like sit down with the rest of the business. Where are we going to find these 26 pennies? So, okay, people are like, oh, I've got an idea. Why not we sell the second van because we only use it once every 2 months? And we can rent a van instead once every 2 months instead of paying off a loan for the second van. You do the math and you calculate it and go like, oh, great, that would save overheads. That would make it 9p instead of 10p. Great. So we found 1p worth of savings there. It's like, oh, okay. So if we manage our shop stock better in such a way where we don't have huge stockpiles of like products that aren't selling, because that costs the business more money. And we bring in products with higher margin and we don't keep as much. We only just keep small amounts, very small amounts. We only stock it up only even when needed. That will bring it down. Okay, so if we add up our plan, what will it do? Oh, okay, looks like we can reduce this down by like 3p, and that will take us to 12p instead of 15p. And so on and so on. You could do the same kind of thinking process with ingredients as well. Oh, what's super expensive? Oh, it turns out we're paying like hundreds of pounds every month in mint. Because like mint herbs are really expensive, let me tell you. Can we like not use mint? Can we use something else? Or like can we not buy so much and then let it rot because it looks like our ingredients management system isn't like working very well and we let half the mint rot, you know. It's just like small, it's like loads of things like that add up and you kind of calculate the impact of it and it's like, okay, looks like we can save like 2p from this. And that adds up to like 23p instead. So that means you can bring all your operating costs down to 44p in this example. And then the business is like, great, I think we've done absolutely everything possible that we can do in operating expenses while still maintaining our like quality and integrity. And then it's like, okay, looks like if we want to allocate 1p of surplus, 1p towards surplus, then we're going to have to bring labor down by 20p. So it goes down to 55p. Then you might start having some slightly more emotionally more difficult conversations there. I mean, the way that we did it in Bread Co-op was more like everyone took an hour's cut and some people volunteered that they wanted more hours anyway because they wanted to drop down to part-time anyway. And some people took less of an hour's cut. And of course, like I'm focusing a lot on the cost side of the business, but like you can still look at the kind of the revenue of the sales side of the business. And like sales is really important to us too. But from experience, that is a lot more difficult. Basically, what you're going to have in a business is a bucket with a lot of holes. And even if you pour more revenue into it, you're still going to have hardly any water left, or even like maybe negative water by the end of it. The thing is, like, if you wanted to say and achieve like a 10p saving in any of these categories, like the equivalent of a 10p saving in any of these categories, you have to bring in more than that in sales because of your cost of sales. So if your cost of sales is like 30% of revenue, for example, if you to achieve the equivalent of say a 10p saving in labor, you'd need to bring in 13p worth of new sales in. like from experience, that is a lot more difficult than doing things that are actually within your own control. So the side of looking at sales always comes with more risk. Okay, so in summary, I stopped assuming that sales was going to save the day, and I showed the co-op why we need to take cost side of the business more seriously. That led us to be getting very creative and finding the savings where we needed them. These new cost management measures really lifted the business into financial stability over time. And we were able to like invest in things like replacing equipment and offering better wages and sick pay and eventually agreeing like a modest year-end bonus.
And then obviously this is kind of the way we've looked at this, it very much feels like a crisis management tool. And it's kind of like, yeah, how to adjust your spending to impact your surplus and loss numbers. How would you say that this relates to a co-op on ongoing basis? Because, you know, if there is a co-op that is already trading and has a 1p surplus, is this relevant to them?
Yes, it's still super relevant. We still use this in all our reporting. People really understand this model, and people have found previous finance reports a lot harder to understand but now we use the £1 model a lot, and people literally like ask for it. Like, what would the £1 model look like if we did this? What would the £1 model look like if we did this? Like they want to know what would happen, because it's quite understandable. You can literally go like, okay, well, if we, say bought the second van, then overheads would go up by 2p, and overall the business looks like this at the moment in terms of its costs, and therefore our surplus would only go down from like 7p to 5p or something like that. It's very accessible way of talking about finance and looking at the financial aspects of decisions. So we use it a lot. We also use it as a way of like keeping ourselves accountable. So like we've agreed that we want ingredients to be maintained at a certain ratio. We don't want ingredients to go beyond, say, I don't know, 21p or whatever. Like we keep track of those ratios, and we report on them every quarter. And if they do go beyond those agreed guidelines, then we ask like why, what's happening? Do we need to adjust the guidelines, or was it a one-off thing that we just need to budget for next time and expect?
I think that's probably a good place to leave it. Thanks, Ivan, for coming on. Really appreciated you taking the time to share your knowledge and the lessons you've learned.
Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed listening, please consider supporting Punchcard by going to our Open Collective page at opencollective.com/workerscoop/projects/punchcard and starting a monthly contribution. If you are interested in finding out more about worker cooperatives, then check out workers.coop's website, and don't be shy to send any questions you have or ask for support by emailing solidarity@workers.coop.